Welcome to the Metamodern Bodhisattva Roundtable. Okay, it's a wrap. So where I wanted to begin our exploration together is maybe starting just personally with what is the Bodhisattva path? What does it mean to you in your lives? Yeah. So let's you got a big nod there, Layman. So maybe we're going to start.
It's on me because
Yeah,
the nod.
the nod and the bling. Yeah.
When I used to be more formally part of Buddhist communities, this sort of compassion and care-based ethical move of not focusing solely on your own existential transformation, but trying to take care for all the beings in the world was the way I framed it. But now more and more, it's the sat part that I zero in on, right? That's the cultivation of beingness in a way that incorporates the full spectrum of what we experience to be the principles and beings that make up ourselves in the world that we're in. Like a plural, full spectrum, fully complex, fully human, fully naturalized way of engaging in the existential process of generating surplus coherence in oneself.
It sounds. How do you see that is differing from maybe the traditional way of?
I think that it's based on how you understand the world, right? The Bodhisattva path, as opposed to classically the Arhat path, is an embrace of all the beings, all the things that exist in the world. And as your sense of what that world consists of changes, then it attenuates the nature of the Bodhisattva path, right? The Bodhisattva path today includes all kinds of organisms that we know about now that they didn't know about in Tibet 1,000 years ago. Maybe it includes artificial organisms as well. It certainly includes a sense of our deep human interior plurality that was not as emphasized traditionally as it is now.
Thank you. Keith, how does it live for you?
I mean, it lives in a very complex yet simple way for me. And so in the simple way, it's more like it's a vow that's impossible to keep, at least in my experience. And so it's a vow that I fail at again and again. And so there's a humility in sort of taking this unconquerable vow. But for me, the Bodhisattva vow has a number of parts to it. One is how we re-embrace the mythic interpretation of what it actually stands for, how we interpret that in the modern era, like you're saying. It has a communal piece, like what are we doing as a collective? Because we're not practicing as individuals, we're practicing as part of a community. And how do we keep an eye on collective narcissism and groupthink and all these problems that have traditionally crept into practice communities, virtually without exception? How do we use the vow as a developmental attractor, where it's not just about awakening, but it's also about expanding our capacity and our ego? So it's elements like that, I think, that is really expanded for me. And I think at the end of the day, it's a vow to move beyond your egocentric, self-centric point of view. And that's maybe where it starts and ends.
Right. What I hear you sharing is, well, the impossibility. There's both a sense of freedom and a sense of fullness. What I sense with what Layman shared is how the fullness has increased, and also there's more complexity, there's more spectrum, there's a lot more color to the fullness now. And yet there's also a kind of a strength or verticality that comes from the freedom dimension that is maybe just aligned with the quality of purpose that one might not ordinarily have.
Yeah. And to me, the fact that it's an unattainable vow, it's kind of like, I think I mentioned this to you, but Alexander, but it's like doing shadow work. Right? It's like your shadow work is never done.
Never done.
You're still doing. My teacher was doing shadow work in the 70s. It was a wonderful experience to see a Zen Roshi who was like, I guess I got to go do this small cell shit again. Go and clean up your messes.
Right.
To me, it has that element.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Catherine.
Well, for people who are not familiar with the Bodhisattva vow, we dedicate all of our life energy to the benefit of all beings. And I just find that so exciting and inspiring. And I love re-examining time and again, how can I benefit all beings in new ways? And how can I extend that to what does all beings even mean? And I get excited about extending that to the beings that I can't see, whether it's microorganisms in the soil or deities or sprites, nature spirits, people I'll never meet, future generations. This keeps me, I feel like it's a very creative act. How can I do that more? Given I only have 24 hours in the day, how can I do that in the best way that I can? And I love what Keith said. It does require a lot of humility because there are certainly times when it feels like it's not working. And we need to practice a lot of self-care, include ourselves in that same bodhisattva vow so that we can stay on it, because it is a very long game.
It's a long game.
It's in my tradition, a multiple lifetime game.
Yeah, that's something I'd love for us to explore in a little bit. So let's just click on that, on how important a multi-lifetime narrative is to this journey, the cosmology, and whether that's ontologically true or not, how that lives as a narrative to empower a kind of journey that might not be possible otherwise. So I hear that's really important. And I also feel like that what we're pointing to is that what's one of the unique elements, or double clicked with the Bodhisattva path, is it's about relationality and how that deepens and expands more and more and more, and in doing so opens us up as practitioners. So let's
yes, well said.
Yeah, let's remember those two pieces. Alexander.
Yeah, yeah. For me, there's a sense of, I guess, like a unification between wisdom and compassion. And by wisdom, I mean the process of awakening to the unbroken ground. The Chinese character for wisdom shows the heart, and then above it there's like a broom that's like sweeping away all the obscurations from the heart. And there's something about, at that moment, or in that process of the individual agent either dissolving or no longer taking center stage, that the only natural response is compassion, because there's no separate agent that is trying to get something. There's just inexhaustible giving, and then there's the territory of then leaning into, because now there's no separation, leaning into the suffering that's everywhere, and experiencing that as if it was one's own suffering, because at that point it is one's own suffering. There's not like a being over there that suffers and then I'm not suffering. It's this one thing happening, and then that embrace of love that liberates that suffering, or digests it, or alchemizes it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. As I was reflecting upon, just for myself, as I was sitting here, what was coming up was how the Bodhisattva path is a path of love, wisdom, and the wisdom aspect is related to the unboundedness and the openness, and the love aspect is related to the relationality, which is both a big yes and also a big no. Like when there needs to be a yes, and when there needs to be a no, a no. But it also, at least for me, it's a path of practice that invites like the the possibility of wide and deep realization within relationship and within embodiment and within the complexity of the lives that we're living. And also comes from a kind of maybe a non-theistic perspective where you can build that practice within you without necessarily having a lot of metaphysics. I mean, it does help at a certain point maybe to have a larger cosmology, but we can see how that the world right now needs the kind of servant leaders, if you will, who aren't just wrapped up in themselves. Yeah. So traditionally, Catherine, you were talking about a multi-lifetime journey, sojourn, and this practice kind of does sit within a particular kind of narrative, and in many ways, all the practices that you do, the sitting practice that we do, the martial art practices, the psychedelic practices, the community practice, they all sit within a story. If that makes sense, like actually that the meta context is the story. And so traditionally there's a whole cosmology and there's this kind of the heroic altruist journey over many lifetimes, like leaving the village 10,000 years ago and we're still on our way back, if you will. So I'm really curious how, like, what is the kind of narrative that that your practice sits in, and also perhaps that we need, because the kind of extraordinary practitioners that we saw throughout history, whether that's Milarepa on top of the mountain wearing his dhoti and just practicing tumo, or whether it's those who are deeply committed in the village and in the towns, it seems to me like a self-help frame is not going to provide the kind of purpose and the kind of energy for the kind of journey that we're on. So I'm curious.
Well, one thing that comes up for me is, this also comes up with what Keith was talking about in terms of the shadow work never being done. And I think many of us experience these moments where we want the shadow work to be done, or we want the generosity that we're trying to give to the world, we want it to be done. And that comes from a aspect of the self that's still experiencing separation.
Mm-hmm.
And, the unbroken dimension of being, there's no done or not done.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the gesture is infinite, an infinite outpouring of love, that the question of, do I need to commit to do this forever?
Mm-hmm.
From that vantage point, it's just already what is occurring. And my sense is that the invitation towards that commitment, which is often a lot of the things that come up in certain teachings, where the commitment is helping us try to align towards this North Star.
Mm-hmm.
But then the North Star itself, there is no commitment needed at that point. But we do need to fumble our way towards it as we're kind of trying to find a place in that inexhaustible kind of care that it's like lifetimes, like eternity.
Mm-hmm.
It's just love anyway. So,
that's right.
Yeah.
What I hear you saying is that perhaps from a metamodern perspective, that narrative is a finger that's pointing in a particular kind of direction.
Mm-hmm.
Much like other aspects of the practice, and they can align the imagination with something, but it's not the same thing as when it's online as a natural inherent intelligence.
Yeah.
And then eternity or the end of time, it's not really a factor.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, great. Now you've ended that conversation. So anybody that comes after that. Boom. Okay. Catherine.
Yeah, I think to build on what Alexandra just said so beautifully, is there really anything else that we'd rather be doing, right? Other than benefiting all beings in the ways that we're called, which is going to be really different depending on the person. And each person gets to decide how, in what ways, how, when, where you get to benefit all beings. And that's such a fantastic, creative call to the life that you want to lead, or your daemon, or your North Star. And whether you believe in reincarnation or rebirth, as you can think about the 7 generations time scale, or until our star dies. However you'd like to look at it. We'll be on other stars by then, I imagine, and so we'll be benefiting beings there. It's as Alexander touched on, infinity. It's infinite in both time and space. There's a wonder to that.
Yeah, thank you. Layman.
Yeah, I have, in one sense, a kind of indifference to narratives, but it's not an indifference that forecloses the importance of narratives. And I associate that with the metamodern sensibility, and sometimes called sincere irony, or, making sure that you understand that everything's in quotation marks, but those quotation marks don't reduce the significance. They could be amplifiers of the significance. So the narrative that I notice myself being in love with and acting out has to do with integrative development as the existential path, right? As the construction of beingness as a viable option that offers something that's in tandem with, but a little bit different than thinking of being as the fundamental, unconditional ground, right? It can also be thought of as something that we're building up through the integration of our perspectives and drives and energies, and through the Bodhisattva's impulse to lean into suffering. You're bringing different, disparate energies together in an act of suffering, right? And there are traditions of enlightenment where you're trying to get away from the world, to get away from suffering. Well, Bodhisattva sort of is open to that suffering. And in that act of being open to suffering, you're creating more integration because you're trying to get more coordination between these disparate forces. So that ongoing journey is the personal aspect of the narrative that I like, but it's embedded in a narrative about what the unfolding cosmos is doing, that it's somehow trending in a direction, right? Not that we necessarily imagine that there's a force outside that determined where it should go, but it has a slope to it. It prefers over time certain directions. And that preference has resulted in the establishment of the ecosystems, the biospheres, the life world that we're a part of. And out of that, a noosphere, a human cultural, technological, and psychological environment that needs to be aligned with and in service to those ecological patterns. So one way that I think about the Bodhisattva vow is that it's going to remain in service to ecologies, right? Social ecologies, biological ecologies, cosmic ecologies, rather than exiting the system. It's here to play a role in the system. And we mentioned this yesterday, the idea that to some significant degree, your own existential unfolding is the byproduct of your service to the ecologies that you're in, right? There's something very bodhisattvic about that orientation. That's a big part of the narrative that I hold.
Yeah.
Did I hear something in there about collaboration? I
mean, ecologies are fundamentally collaborative, right? When you take a notion of the mutuality of plural beings inside and out as your framework, then collaboration becomes the thing that replaces the idea of the individual's quest to either be themselves or overcome themselves. I think that a lot of the qualities we used to associate with the individual, whether it's the modern idea of the individual or God gave us this soul or some old story like that, those are qualities of better teamwork among our components, inner collaboration and outer collaboration with other people, people of all kinds, but especially those who have similar projects to our own, and also to other beings and other systems that we're embedded in.
And so we're collaborating here today.
Yes,
And
we are.
everyone listening or
Mhm.
watching is collaborating.
Thank you, Layman. And Keith.
Yeah, I mean, well, the Zen perspective is a little different, especially the Zen Zen perspective. In our lineage, all that matters is experience and insight.
Mhm.
Right? I do not rely upon beliefs, sensations, and ideas which arise and fall away.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, a bodhisattva vow, or the idea of love, or the practice of compassion, we would say they are uh, performative until you have the interior illumination of why the vow actually exists as an externality.
Mhm.
And when the interior illumination comes up, then the vow comes alive from the inside, not as an injunction or not as an edict, but as something that is so obvious and
Mhm.
clear that it lives itself.
Mhm.
And so there is no volition or will that's required at all.
Mhm.
And that's just one example. The idea of compassion, like in the deepest places of practice, when we really contact the fundamental, absolute stillness, my experience is that out of the emptiness, the very first thing that comes up, and I have no idea why this is the case,
Mhm.
but the very first thing that comes out of emptiness is compassion.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's because we're social animals. I don't know if it's just a biologic. I don't know if it's because of a creator. I have no experience of why, but I know that the first thing that comes up, and me and other people I've checked in with out of the stillness, is compassion.
Mhm.
It's a very curious thing.
Seems to be hardwired into the very architecture of who we are as human beings.
It seems to be that way. And I don't know why.
Right.
Because in Zen, we would say, we neither believe nor disbelieve in a creator. It just depends on if you've experienced that, then let's talk about your experience. If it's a belief or an idea, come back
Right.
to your dish.
That's right. But and of course, there's also the element here that that once you realize a form is empty, then there's the other move, which means, well, then thoughts and beliefs actually do matter because they're also an expression of that truth,
That's right.
right? So, and particularly from, let's say, a metamodern developmental context, is it does matter because it matters about the effectiveness through which that wisdom and love can be expressed.
The skillful means, we would say.
The skillful means,
Yeah.
right? One of the things that I heard that that Layman was alluding to, and I think that it's really interesting to explore, is that from a traditional context, so much of the path was contextualized within a kind of multi-lifetime system that where the human being was removed from the planetary system, as opposed to the bodhisattva as a kind of planetary ecological function that actually that it's not like we're trying to find freedom from a planetary system. Actually, we're trying to serve within something, right? Which I think is a very different perspective than the traditional one. So I'm curious, how do you guys experience like the bodhisattva as embedded within an ecological function of a planetary system, as opposed to being separate from it?
Oh, goodness. Well, we are part of the ecology.
Mm.
So it's a kind of self-compassion in one way, to be compassionate in an ecological context. It's also very smart, given that the future of the planet is currently in a state of question, would be an understatement.
Yeah.
And I think that's a beautiful thing about this metacrisis is that it's really inescapable, that we need to be dedicating ourselves to the future of the planet, the future of Gaia, however you work with that, so that we can benefit all beings, so that we can still be around to benefit all beings.
Mm-hmm.
It is in our own, if there were a self, it would be in our own self-interest.
Right. Oh.
and in the interest of all beings.
Yeah. So it brings up for me sympoiesis, the sort of becoming with each other, becoming with the world, bringing forth together. And, as you were pointing to, as soon as we talk about ecology, we're talking about ourselves, not as an individual sort of I space, but, as Layman was pointing to, if we place this within a cosmic context, an emerging, evolving, unfolding process, the whole human and non-human world that is out there is also constituting our bones and our cellularity and all of these things. And to me, there's a sense of taking that on in a phenomenological way, which I think, Keith, you're pointing to. The direct experience of that invites a kind of intimacy that exploding stars, not as an I mean, the idea is cool, that our bodies are constituted in part by the fundamental explosions of stars, but to actually, what does it mean to have an intimacy with that in a direct experience? And then in those moments, there's the reflection between what's in here and what's out there. There's an interreflection. There's a sense that, as you pointed to, it's like taking care of, planetary ecology is an act of self-care, and it happens both as we're leaning that way and as we're leaning this way, and that we're interdependent. We are one another. We can't undo that, and that includes the non-human world that we often forget about. It's like atoms. It can be such a conceptual kind of thing, but they're helping to make our shirts, along with the untold amounts of human beings that are also fashioned within that same ecology that created, that helped with the plants and the plants that were grown, or however the shirts were made, and the way that we're all here, we're so intertwined. Yeah.
What I was receiving from what you were saying, Alexander, is that for the Metamodern Bodhisattva, Buddha nature is nature. So it's not that there's a nature separate from gross nature. Of course, nature extends growth, subtle, causal. So it's not just the form, but that as practitioners, there's a sensibility to the evolutionary nature of nature that she's unfolding, and that we are unfolding with her, as her, if you will. And from those, let's say, from those deeper, more expanded states of awareness, we are the planetary system, right? And yet we're also, like, we are Buddha nature, and then we're also residing and held within Buddha nature. And, yeah, I think, Layman, that speaks to when we were discussing earlier, how, like, what is the basic minimal thing that we can agree upon to activate a Metamodern Bodhisattva code? And I think one of the things you were pointing to was that evolutionary impulse. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there are fantasies about what a richer, esoteric, planetary wisdom civilization would look like, and we want to encourage that. But we also need the basic operating platform of civilization that holds all the people who are not necessarily going to undertake those tasks themselves, but who make the undertaking of those tasks more available to the people who want them. So what's that minimal operating system that we need as a society? What are its basic features? It seems like evolutionary unfolding is one of those basic features, that there's a historicity and a layering of information regimes that make up different qualities of reality, that we play a role in that. The other one, as I've mentioned before, is taking plurality seriously, right? That we have male and female and conscious and unconscious, and we have heart, mind, and body, or we have chakras, or we have different brain modules, however we want to think about that. The understanding of the plurality of the psyche and the plurality of the world as the basis for integration, collaboration, something like that. That seems to be an essential part of it. There's one other thing I wanted to touch on, though, in this talk about Buddha nature, is the multiplicity of the Buddha ecologies. There's this beautiful notion of the three Buddha bodies, Sambhogakaya and Dharmakaya and Nirmanakaya. Very often we think about it in Nirmanakaya terms, right? We're talking about the ecosystem of solid entities in the world. And there's so many more of them. It's fantastic. And we take them in, we put them out, of ourselves. We process and we refine and we play a role. But there's also a sense in which we do that with the paradoxical limit of all limits, the ground of being. We have a Dharmakaya kind of ecology where we receive something like that and excrete something like that. And we have a subtle one where the delicate ambient enjoyments of nature are also something we need to take in and process and refine. So that for me, the Bodhisattva vow also comes close to something like a shamanic imperative, which is to play a role not just in the gross aspects of nature, but in the subtler energies that we see within ecological systems.
Right. So in one of the Sanskrit terms other than kaya is dhatu. So we have like the kama dhatu or the dhamma dhatu, so the desire realm or the realm of truth. And in Sanskrit, dhatu is also a term used in medicine to refer to a tissue. So from a planetary perspective, there's a planetary system, if you will, that has these tissues. There's a physical tissue, there's a etheric tissue, so on and so forth, much like we would see from a kind of multi-energetic perspective in Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine. And so the planetary system perspective here doesn't just mean the physical. It's not just the physical. It extends to all those dimensions of practice. And what I love what you're saying is that actually that the human being has a secretory function, a function of that even at the level of aesthetics, even the level of perception, there's something about how we perceive and how we metabolize what we receive that is released into that wider system, that it's actually part of the nadis, the channels, the circulatory system and the dhatus of this larger planetary system that we're part of. And part of the function of a bodhisattva is to begin to awaken to that multi-ecological function that we have, right? So how, it's clear that we have there's a kind of, one of the things that's happening right now in our time, and this is this psychedelic revolution. And it seems to me that part of that is kind of opening up some of these other realms of experience and practice so that we can begin to embody that kind of multi-ecological stewarding. So I'm curious, well, actually from a Zen perspective, do you see is that seen from a metamodern context as just makyo? Is that the term, like just illusion, or is there how it?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Because if you say illusion, then you're really caught in a duality. Because then what's not an illusion?
Yeah.
I think Zen would just be more simple, which is it's just the orientation, the view you start with, and the view is always things are as they are, and they can be no other way. That's all. Any conversation starting with that radical acceptance of what is, because we are all a part of what's unfolding. And how could things be different than they are?
Yeah.
When I see the bumper sticker that says resist, it just makes my heart hurt, because that's the definition of suffering. Resisting what is.
Yeah.
Can Buddhism 101.
Sure.
And if we orient to radical things are as they are and they could be in no other way, then for me, that opens us to a compassion to what is. And rather than being against things in the world, we're only ever for things.
Beautiful.
I can be for the environment and not against corporations. I can be for love and not against hate. Right? I can be for peace and not against war. All these, by breaking apart some of these self-created illusions of separateness. It's like, oh my God, the environment, it's this and it's like, okay, things are as they are, and they can be in no other way. So what needs to happen?
It sounds like a fundamental code of relationality to yes to what's arising,
as opposed to what?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that being said, then, like, we were like psychedelics and this and the subtle realms, so to speak, and this kind of ecological perspective. I'm curious, how does that live for you?
Yeah, if I could backtrack to Layman's really interesting comments about the different kayas, just in case viewers and listeners aren't familiar with those, I'd like to run through them briefly to give some context. So to Nirmanakaya, and please chime in, I think we've all got different interpretations and many are valid. So Nirmanakaya is this world that we can see, the physical world, and many of us were raised in a scientific, materialistic context. Sambhogakaya is where you get the sense of visions, the sense of more happening than what we can see and connect with these physical senses. And then the Dharmakaya, I connect that with the emptiness that Keith was talking about. That's really beyond. And as longtime spiritual practitioners all know, we're operating, we're functioning, we're connecting with all three of these simultaneously. And then depending on our practice, depending on how we are in the moment, will determine how we're operating in those three kayas and which ones are dominating. Nirmanakaya is the coarsest, so it's kind of the easiest. You can grab it. And Dharmakaya is probably the most efficient because you don't really need to do very much to affect tremendous transformation, which is why the practice of virtue is so important, because you can seed virtue there and it goes to infinity, to timelessness. And so psychedelics are something that really help us get a very lived sense of this, so that it's not just words, but we can have that direct experience. And then they also introduce this challenge of duality, because it's through the introduction of an external agent, whether plant medicine, for example, that we feel that we're able to access this. I don't know if it's true for all plant medicines, but the ones I've been familiar with, it's not the plant medicine itself, it's that they activate something that's already in the human system that's there. And so it's an experience that's innate to us, which longtime meditators have more of a connection with. And personally, I think that's why meditation is so valuable, to integrate the profound experiences that we have with psychedelics. And that helps us ground it in this plane, because this is where we're living most of the time.
So I wanted to say one thing first related to the sort of the ecological nature that I think has some symbols in it that might be supportive. One of the characters for awakening, it shows the radical for the heart next to a character that has two parts to it, and by itself it's the character for me or I, and it shows a mouth, which in this case is the symbol for like a passage, something can pass through. And then above it is the number 5, and an earlier iteration of the number 5, it shows heaven and earth. It's sort of like Roman numeral 10, right? It shows heaven and earth with an X in the middle, and it's speaking about this ecological self, that the self is not a singularity as we might think in the West, but the self is ecology. And as Layman's pointing to, and it's been coming up here, as our developmental dimensions unfold and get bigger, what we consider ecology gets bigger. And so in this way, awakening is when the heart, or through the heart, there's an opening to this passageway into this ecological self that gets increasingly bigger and bigger. And in terms of psychedelics, there's less that I can say about them specifically, but I guess what I'll lean into is the subtle perceptions that they induce. I think that, in this world, a lot of us have been brought up, as you pointed to, in this sort of orienting to the material world as like, these are the nouns that matter. Like, this is the real stuff. And I think there's some deep value in, however it opens in us, learning how to see through the world, not past it, but through it into the subtler dimensions, where there are, if to use this language that we've been talking about, some of the Sambhogakaya light. There's this sweet qualities of light that are instantiated within the materiality. And this again invites a kind of intimacy with the world, that when things are just solid material nouns, it's easy to like trip over something or punch something or say, yeah, like look at Facebook, there's so much of just like, you suck, you're a noun and you suck. But it's like, there's a way in which these substances or other practices, they awaken for us the sweet light. And so then we want to lean into each other, even if on the surface there's like grimace and disagreement. A simpler way to say it is just it opens us up to more of the world that we've maybe either forgot in the way the modern sort of structures of society are built. It just helps us see more. And then it's easier to love because things are luminous. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, psychedelics, plant medicines, they in the upper right quadrant, right? They're great. They change the brain chemistry, and in changing the brain chemistry, they can mimic deep spiritual states, and they can open people up to the experience of a world that's different than what they're seeing through their controlled ego states, where they're just essentially what we're all doing all the time. All human beings, without exception, are projecting what we think is reality onto the unfolding of this sort of living mystery that is actually what's here. And psychedelics can give non-practitioners and practitioners the sense of, holy shit, a world beyond self. Wow. What does the world look like without me in between it and the phenomena that's arising? And so to me, it can be a radical opening for both lay people and also deep practitioners to help give you the experience of actually what deep meditative awareness shows us. That's what I'm saying. So it's huge. And then from a therapeutic perspective, and I've done ketamine-assisted, psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, incredibly helpful to getting around defensive ego structures. And again, it's a hack to the biological brain that can save us, years, decades of work.
Yeah.
And as a practitioner, I've seen so many practitioners that sit on their cushions for years and years, and they're bound by these concepts and ideas of awakening and liberation and, all these thought forms and beliefs. And they're suffering.
Yeah.
And a little bit of LSD, and suddenly the whole thing, the veil falls away. So that's how I do it. It's a very powerful tool. And now that it's breaking into the mainstream, there's more and more people that are accessing something that only contemplatives could access in the past. And that's too small of a pool for us to affect the planetary system.
Thank you.
Could I add here just a note of caution that I do? I think this goes without saying, but it is worth saying that a very good and wholesome container is really essential for these kinds of experiences.
Please don't try it on your own.
Yeah. So
Closed course profession driver.
yeah, groundedness, good friends, virtue. These are the things that help these very, very powerful substances be a positive experience and transformational, and don't send us off someplace amazing and cosmic, but without a roadmap to get back and without a roadmap to integrate it into our lives in a positive way.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah. Setting from a set of setting of goodness, truth, and beauty, then it can unfold in such a way and come back to that as well.
Psychedelics. I think of the psychedelic as a kind of dimension of patterning, right? There's something psychedelic about the effects of entheogens on the brain. There's also something psychedelic about watching a fractal unfold in a computer system, or, looking at how the deep jungle is operating. It's a certain style of universal patterning. There's very different ways of accessing that style, and esoteric practitioners have always taken advantage of entheogens to some degree, but have pursued many other kinds of practices. But for the general population, I think it's absolutely essential, first of all, to normalize healthy and intelligent use of entheogens as part of that minimum operational layer for wisdom civilization. And that's partly a return to the ancient normal pattern. Right, the last few thousand years, it's been very contested in civilized areas whether or not to use or which substances. But it seems like for the longer period of human history, for dozens of thousands of years, it was part of the normal self-regulatory healing and attunement practices for villages, not constant casual usage, but periodic ritual usage to help reset individuals and communities. So I think that's absolutely essential. I think in most cases, I 90% agree with caution, right? Get the setting right. We're not very good at integration. All of these things are important, how we set the frame, having experienced practitioners to help you. But there's also something to be said for the risk of the feral entheogenic experience. And what our risky explorers find out about the culture we're living in through unchecked exploration of those things with a psychedelic lens. Like, I think we gain a lot from a Hunter S. Thompson who's going to get on the president's plane with a head full of LSD. That's a sampling of the noosphere in a really interesting way. And I don't want to foreclose that by saying, well, we should have a good, safe ayahuasca space. So there is a role for that risk.
Yeah, there's definitely a role for the trickster. That's what I'm hearing.
Can I respond to that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks, Layman. I'm right with you. I think that part of where my comments came from is that when I first was exploring plant sacrament, it was in the context of community, the community that made the ayahuasca and the community that did it together and the community that showed up to work and live together day after day in order to integrate it together. This I'm referring to when I went to the Brazilian Amazon because I was so keen on ayahuasca. And I really respect ayahuasca is really hard to make. And I wonder a lot about the supply chain, and I wonder a lot about the relationship with the communities that are providing it. And I wonder a lot about the sustainability and the connection with those peoples, because we are talking partly about relationality, right? And relations and bodhisattva vows with all the beings that we cannot necessarily see. So how is our relationship with those people? Is the relationship with the environments that are producing these substances and the ways that they're being harvested and distributed? I don't know if there's fair trade certification for these things, but I think it's really time so that we can build these connections with these communities that are doing such a great service to the communities in this part of the world.
I think that's essential. And I'm going to add in one more complicating element, because those relationships and the embedding, all those connections and how we support those things, those very often involve the long evolved substances that have come to us through the history of the biosphere, and that people have a history with that. But every single day, pharmaceutical labs are inventing new psychedelics that have no history in the biosphere. And those have to be handled in a different way. They're unknown portals. Maybe where they go is already covered by the great search engine of nature's history, or maybe it's completely unknown territory. So one thing to think about with psychedelics is, how do we prepare people to be explorers into new portals that our noosphere is generating that didn't necessarily evolve in tandem with the rest of the ecosystem and in the rest of culture?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's something there around just the nature of our historical journey, and when psychedelics and plant sacraments were taken off the table in Europe, in the ancient world. I often do a little thought experiment and well, what would it like have been if the Alexandrian Academy didn't go and we had had chemistry, that kind of chemistry, for 2,000 years, and of course, it would have been informed by sacred world, and so where would our chemistry be now, and what kind of psychedelics would we be, and sacraments would we be ingesting now? And it seems to me that, well, actually, with the advent of AI, and we should maybe tap into that, we're going to be doing fast catch up, right? 2,000 years of catch up in a few decades. But the question as to whether and how those sacraments are aligned, or whether they're aligned or not, it remains to be seen.
It's funny you say that, because in the West, I think it was William James, excuse me, his brother, was really the first major philosophical self-explorer who decided to use, I think he used nitrous oxide to explore his consciousness. But you're right, all these centuries in the West, where people were doing all of this kind of without the aid of these things that were part of our culture until this cutoff point. And it makes, I think the larger point is, it makes exploring the things we're talking about here, what is the Bodhisattva vow, it does make it a harder exploration, because again, there's so few people that can come to a genuine deep insight without being part of some sort of ritualized medicine practice, which helps make it easier.
Right.
And we don't want to just use that, of course, right? But then it's just so much harder if we don't allow ourselves some of these things that can actually give us a little bit of a shortcut. Oh, this is what the practice is about.
Right. The traditional medicine dharma containers.
Yeah.
And that's scalable, right? It's very hard to scale up contemplative practice in a huge way, but you have a physical object that you can multiply across the system and introduce that to people in a very quick, repeatable, reliable way. That's important to a civilization transformation.
Well, and there's also the piece around, I would imagine various cultures work with the technology, with a kind of sacramental technology in different ways. I would imagine some allow the medicine to do what it wants to do, and others perhaps shape the experience to some degree or not. And so not only can you scale the medicine, but you can also scale the ritual and the structure within which that happens. Obviously, the Bodhisattva path contains a kind of meditative component. It contains a wisdom component, an ethical component, a creative component, but the vow does seem to be a central component to how it gets integrated. So I'm really curious, how do we see the function of vow from a metamodern context, and then, well, let's start there, and then we'll look at, well, how is that brought into each moment? How is that brought into how we are showing up for each other right now?
Yeah, I can say some things here. For me, with my father dying when I was 20, quite young, it sort of brought forward in my life this recognition of sort of death is certain. And I know for all of us, we come to that conclusion at some point. But for me, it came early. And, over the years, there's been a sense of, two questions that I like to hold. One is, what can I take with me when I go? And what do I want to leave behind? And those for me sort of become a North Star in terms of it's a prioritization question. What's most important? What I leave behind is what I can give. That's the compassion, the care, the inexhaustible kind of generosity and giving. And what can I take with me is what happens, in that orientation towards that unbroken ground or practice. And so for me, with that prioritization question, then it opens like, what do I want to put a stake in the ground around? Mm-hmm. And I think maybe earlier the notion of vow was, okay, there's a supreme leader that's going to tell me what the vows are, and I'm going to take them on, and I'm going to use my willpower. And I think that's really valuable when we're looking at a developmental continuum. And then at some point, I think it's natural to deconstruct all of that and just to throw it all away. And I see this a lot in, various communities where deconstruction and, plurality and relativism and all these things become the like in vogue thing that I'm going to toss out the stake in the ground because it feels too solid. Mm. And then I wonder about, then reclaiming the stake in the ground after that, where there are things that for me are just simply more important than anything else, which comes back to those two questions. What am I going to give? And what practice carries with me when, I leave and my wife doesn't come with me, the house and the car and the friends and all those things. Whatever happens later, I don't know. That's a mystery. But for me, that becomes the sort of place from which the vow arises. And I like to hold, especially because I'm often in relationship with communities that are very fluid and flexible. I like to also bring in that there's this place of, no, I have a stake in the ground. Like, I'm going to practice these things because they're more important to me than anything else. Because I know death is imminent. And so it keeps like what matters most in view, at least some of the time. Yeah.
Well, living the Bodhisattva vow, I think my relationship with that has certainly changed over the years, and I think that is normal. That's probably standard in the early days. There's a lot of changing of habits. I was conditioned to think about this thing that we label as the self pretty obsessively. And to let that go, as Keith's describing, let those ego defenses drop, is a process that takes some time. And so there's the ongoing recommitment to the Bodhisattva vow, the ongoing remembering, the ongoing course correction, the ongoing opening that, like Alexander's describing so beautifully. And then the growing realization that it feels so much better to orient from that place, that actually opening up to that experience, letting this sense of self go, opening up to the non-duality of all creation is a joyful experience and a natural one. And then it becomes self-generating, becomes more sustainable, more sustainable in the sense that we can find our groove so that we're able to dwell in that place more consistently on an ongoing basis, and then more generative because it's its own wellspring of joy and energy that keeps us going. Mm.
I've come to appreciate and understand the vow as, well, you were pointing to this earlier, Alexander, like really verb, not noun. Right. So the first thing is it has something to do, at least in my direct experience, with a quality of verticality. Because, of course, a stake is also, it's a horizontal. No, it's not a horizontal stake. It's a vertical stake, right? It goes into the ground. So staking, claiming you're staking into the ground, seems to be a really important part of how it feels and lives as a quality of integrity. And that vowing also has a relationship with death, as if we really do live in a planetary ecosystem that is multidimensional, then the vow has to go all the way through. And our practice has to go all the way through. And I think we all know what it feels like when it doesn't go all the way through. I think that's one of the great values of psychedelic experience or dark retreat or whatever it is, or actually just being in a relationship, right? Is you get to see, does this go all the way through? Right? Does it, can I handle bardo? Can I handle transition? So it does seem that, and I sense that with my friends here, that when it's operating, when vowing is happening, you do have a sense like this is like a rhinoceros in heat. This is right? This can go through the wall, right? It can go, and you can draw upon really great potency, because vowing isn't just individual, it's also part of nature, right? Like the planet is vowing. The kind of evolutionary unfolding. I think we all have a sense that it isn't just random, that actually in the seed, in the bodhicitta of our heart, when openness, but also within the bodhicitta of the planet itself, that what wants to express itself, given the right conditions, is beauty and goodness and truth. And so there is gravity to the vow, because quite literally there is gravity, right? And to the extent that you put your stake in the ground as a sense of verticality, that gravity, that vowing, is literally in the gravity that we're feeling right now when we align ourselves with it. It becomes like fundamental, and it becomes literal, right?
May I add something?
Please, yes.
What occurs to me as you're speaking, in the context of, looking at a vow as a verb, there's this stake in the ground, this verticality that you're describing, and then you also brought up relationship or dark retreat or psychedelics. These are all, an aspect of the horizontal dimension of relationality that, in terms of like, what does it take to walk this notion of a bodhisattva vow in this world? It's our relationships that point out where that stake doesn't go all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the places where we can see these, karmic pockets, or these seeds of potentiality that we haven't seen yet. And, we bump into a relationship where all of a sudden we're like, oh, well, I was committed to loving all beings until you were a jerk, and then all of a sudden that's,
Mm-hmm.
So it's in that becoming with the ecology
Mm-hmm.
that starts to point out the places where the vow isn't complete yet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of the gift of embracing shadow practices and ways of supporting the process of liberating and transmuting those things. And then that's where the vow, it's like, we can talk about recommitment, but it's recommitment not just in from will forces.
Mm-hmm.
It's finding where we're not quite able to hold it in this relational context, and then through working that out, then that vow, the stake goes a little bit deeper, but in a relational context. So the next time we interface with that same or similar kind of relational dynamic, now we're able to move through it. There's a cleanness, or there's an ability to kind of flow through it, rather than all the jagged edges where we were losing track of what we care about. Yeah.
What I hear saying is that cleaning up or shadow work is an intrinsic part of vowing.
Yes.
Right. And in fact, waking up, growing up, cleaning up, showing up, opening up, and really my favorite, fucking up is right.
That's a good one.
It is a good one, and the mishap lineage is a central part of this. So the sophistication of that vow has necessarily been upgraded. Right. I mean, if I was reviewing the Lojong, the mind training precepts from Atisha's lineage, I think that's which I'm not going to say what the date is, but it was pretty evident that it was basically a lot of concrete operational kind of, everyone's good, you're bad, take it all onto yourself, and then if you don't like it, beat yourself with a book, which might have been effective back then, but clearly not effective for us right now. It's not just a question of being selfless, because, as you were alluding to, Catherine, the self is as much a part of the whole as other is. So continuing to how does vowing live within your practice? Yeah, and how does it live?
Yeah,
right now.
I mean, you guys have covered a lot of really good territory. I love what you said on relationality and some of the evolution of it, the interconnectedness of it, the idea that it starts off as something that's concrete. I gave a vow, and then it evolves, into something that's much more realistic and porous and coming from within. The idea, again, for me, is that when compassion, then the compassion that is here flows naturally out of me. There's no need for a vow. But the behavior, the ethics, the morality, they all naturally flow out of that state. You don't have to worry about the vow. The vow is self-manifesting and self-sustaining as part of the insight itself. It's part of the awakening process itself. And in Zen, we talk about these 5 ranks of Zen, where you start off with a kensho, you have a spiritual experience, right? And then you take a vow. That's this idea. I vowed lifetimes and all beings, I will sit here and I will sweat, suffer, and deny, self-deny, self-flagellate, and judge all the people that aren't doing it. and then you have a da kensho, the full awakening. And then, oh my God, everything's falling away. And the vows now become sacred. And then the 3rd rank of Zen is you become fully identified with the absolute. Usually then you go start your cult. And I mean that actually seriously. You're fully identified with the absolute. Keith, there is no Keith. There's only awakened mind, and it's perfect. And by perfect, I mean I'm perfect, right? And then the 4th rank of Zen is when that all falls away. And you begin to see that wow, still completely full of shit. and all this stuff is still here, even though there is this absolute purity. And then, now the vow comes back. Took this stupid vow. And I don't think I'm honoring it anymore. And then the 5th rank of Zen is when you just let it all go. And you just let life live. And you just stop worrying about it. So that's how
There's this semantic tool we have, a vow. We've heard about it. We could say it to each other. We could write about it in books. We could make it part of a Dharma lineage or a wisdom teaching space. And I have enormous appreciation for the role that artifact can play, both in attuning people to some aspect of their nature that's already present, but they have to intentionally tune into it. And also in giving them something, even something impossible, that they can always be rubbing up against, and it's always revealing blind spots and absences. But that's not really my experience of it. My experience of it is the discovery that you're committed, right? Not the desire to be committed, no intention, not interested in taking a vow. Don't trust vows in general. Just notice with some bemusement, I seem to be behaving as if I'm committed in this way. How odd. And then the question comes up for me of well, why? Why I'm in that? How did I get there? Part of it is circumstantial. Part of it is you're lucky. You're reasonably healthy. You got enough love. You appreciated the valuable things of the world enough that your heart is just committed to them. And part of it is something like developmental cognition, which is that you start to notice that all values have something in common, that there's an underlying meta drive, and that every good thing that you could want is actually a variation of the same good thing. And so all you could want is that one good thing, that all values are lined up somehow. And the more you see that, the more you're like, well, I can't help but like good things, so I'm on the track of the good thing. And where's that going to take me? But the other part, the part that is alive for me now and in circumstances, and I think it's pertinent to what the Bodhisattva is a kind of interactive sensitivity, right? So in oneself, right, possibilities come up. And I don't say no to one and yes to the other. I say yes to both. I'm sensitive to both, and I'm sensitive to the friction between. And I allow that. I want that. I want that to change me. And then the same with other beings. There's a sensitivity here and there's a sensitivity there. They're suffering, they're trying, they're responsive. And I want that one to be part of my experience, and I want this one to be part of my experience. And anything that has to be negotiated between those. So for me, I think a lot of the vow is to be present to something like the friction between sensitivities, and then to always be moving in the direction of what results from that act.
But how do you mean holding polarity, be able to hold polarity into something creative, something else creatively arises?
Yeah, I think that describes the machinery of the direction of the vow.
Right.
Is that a harmonizing function, Layman? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. But there's a caution there, which is seeking harmony is sometimes the wrong way to move towards harmony. But harmony is the outcome of the process.
Right. It seems that part of the machinery here then has to do with the alchemy of adversity. Right. That actually the sandpaper, the gristle, isn't actually something to be rejected, but there's a certain yes to circumstances that we would rather not be in, perhaps at a kind of like at a first flinch kind of response. I mean, how does that is that part of that mechanism where there's both kind of on one hand there's the discomfort, on the other hand there's the wanting to avoid it, and then there's a third element of actually learning to say actually a big yes to adversity.
I think there's something, in looking at what's a metamodern version of this. The ancient version thinks the perfected individual is committed to helping all the other beings, or so the imperfected individual is also trying to make that commitment. But that's a asymmetrical move. It's directional. Right? I think a more metamodern way is to think I'm trying to be of service. I want to be of service, but I also want to be changed. I want that grit to modify me in the process.
Yeah, I'm hearing in what you're saying a similar thing to what Alexander was saying, and that it's the conflict and the being with the conflict, the ability to be present with it, that allows our hearts to grow, allows our hearts to dissolve in a way that the spaciousness is the result that can embrace anything in that heart space, and makes our hearts more resilient. To feel like a good heart is really resilient, can handle a lot of ups and downs. There's a kind of heart dojo image coming up in my mind of getting thrown around and some bruises and stuff on the way, and skill being the result. Skill and fluidity.
Yeah. I'm reminded my teacher, Junpo Roshi, he had a senior student who embezzled about $100,000 of his personal living. And he caught her. He and I were at a coffee shop, and he had this sort of pained look, and he was telling me the story. And like, that I noticed this, and I looked in, and she's been stealing from me for 18 months. And he said, people want me to throw her out of the community. And I said, no, it's not quite right. He said, I'm trying to figure out what I did to give her the impression that this kind of behavior would be acceptable. Which was like, what?
Yeah.
Like, and he wasn't collapsing into this is my fault, but it was this inner subjective sand in the wound. Where's my culpability in what happened? And that, to me, that's kind of what I hear you pointing to. Is like, there's always an invitation for this inner subjective. What does the vow mean as far as my own evolution goes? Not out here, not to serve all beings, but in that moment, he was serving his own growth, his vertical ego development, his capacity, his refusal to be against her. And the kind of what happened was she repaid the money over like 5 or 6 years, and then she ended up rejoining the community. She was never shunned.
There's something. What I'm hearing is that this process of vowing and how it operates is less philosophical and has more to do with ethics, yes, but I'm thinking here of as ethics as aesthetics, as a kind of creativity and symmetry and elegance to how things unfold. Because what I'm also hearing is so much of this is about process. It's about process practice. There isn't a goal. The only reason it's a terrible vow is if you think that there's a goal.
Yeah, but that's true of any vow.
No, yeah, for sure, for sure. And if the
vow has an easy goal, then it's
yes,
a vow.
But if it doesn't, it is unending, then the vow becomes much more of a kind of a creative, co-creative, artistic, healing exploration rather than that definitely has a stake in the ground, because you need to have an easel to do the paint. You need something. The verticality is definitely a dimension, but as you're saying, the horizontal is definitely a dimension. But it becomes less of a weight, and it becomes more what I'm actually lighter, more creative, and more livable.
And it seems like in the context of ecology and process, as a cosmos, we've been, enfolding everything as we've been moving forward, and we're carrying a really long history that has so much beauty and so much horror. And it's living within all of us. We're carrying it. And my sense is that when we're in relationship with one another, there's an opportunity for aspects of those hidden pockets of history, the places of our full wholeness that we have walled off because it was just a little bit too much to bear, or maybe a lot too much to bear. It's an opportunity for those things to become metabolized. So there's a diaphaneity. The light can begin to pass through these dark places, and then we rediscover ourselves as more and more of the whole. There's a reclaiming. And this can be in terms of, trauma, collective trauma, wars and all that. But also it can be, benign things and good things. And when was the last time you felt, the atoms like bursting through your system? There's some things that's more like collective shadow, and other things that are, we just forgot. And through our relationships, those things can become awakened or reawakened. And then we have this possibility for the both. When we look at both and, it's like the and is the inclusivity, like, oh, I like your view and I like your view and your view. I like your view too. But it's the both where we're holding things together that, there's friction there. And from an evolutionary context, it's like that's what things burst from.
Mm.
Yeah.
We talked about relationship, but we haven't really talked about the necessity of community, of we, and also, if we're thinking of, let's say, kind of the Manakaya, Sambhogakaya, Dhammakaya, in some ways is like the kind of physical tier, subtle tier, maybe meta-aware tier, that there's a necessity for the capacity to communicate and from the level of realization. And often in the traditional structures, whether that was in Zen, in Dokusan, or actually very similar in the Tibetan system, where it was done in private, and that you didn't talk about your recognition, you didn't talk about your realization. But that's fine. But if actually necessarily, in order to developmentally stabilize a collective of development, you need to participate in a we. And so that we needs to necessarily then be able to share and communicate and speak from and speak as these non-dual levels of realization and subtle levels of realization. And that wasn't really part of the community structures of the past. And so I'm curious, like, how do we see if to stabilize a tier of development, necessarily, first you need to be able to kind of communicate whilst in that state, and then join a collective and then communicate and share your direct experience of that. I mean, how do you see, because that's not a traditional way of how do you see that unfolding in our culture and in a metamodern space?
It's a big question.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, from one perspective, you could say, like, well, what defines an amber culture or an orange culture or a green culture or a teal culture or a turquoise culture, and they all have very different definitions as far as what the rules and agreements and what's seen through, what's subject and what's object. And I think most of our modern spiritual communities, the center of gravity is somewhere around the fourth person perspective. The green, we can track trauma, we can track impact, we see bias, we see shadow. But the invitation is, I think, as we continue to evolve our communities, it is the awareness of the frames that, like, okay, we are all using frames, first unconsciously, and then, oh, there's a frame. This is a Zen retreat. Well, this has a particular frame that we're putting out that's somewhat arbitrary. And the frame allows certain things to arise within it. What are the agreements that we want to have? Do we want to have some green rules, some amber rules, some orange rules, and then what's the purpose? And begin negotiating all these things as part of a living process. And then it gets even more confusing as we move into the metaverse and begin to see the inherent constructed nature of everything. And then the choice point comes up. Well, what do we have actually pretty complete freedom to choose what the community's going to look like. And what do we want to choose from that place? What are the frames that we're going to pick? What are these arbitrary rules that we're going to make? So to me, that's one sort of lower right structural, lower left, lower right structural component that's really interesting. But then personally, it's that, it's the community, it's these conversations that bring it all alive. It's having teachers and having students. It's no fun having dinner alone. We want to play with each other and awaken together and fuck up together and get messy with each other and clean up with each other. And so to me, the invitation of a spiritual community is, for any community really, is to be able to do all this in a way that's self-transparently imperfect. And we can laugh at ourselves and laugh at the group and laugh at the container and laugh at the silliness of it all, and then take it with absolute deathly seriousness.
Thank you, Keith. The metamodern ethos places a high premium on intersubjectivity and collective intelligence and things like that. When it comes to spirituality, then there's a question about how we structure those spaces in a way that gets beyond the dichotomy between the single vertical individual broadcasting to a group of people or a flat egalitarian space where everyone's equal. Right? We're trying to unfold forms that preserve and transcend that dichotomy. I usually think about it as a topology, right? It's a landscape. Everybody's actually different verticality relative to a specific domain. Right, if the domain is spirituality or beingness or something like that, you still have everybody at a different spot. And so how do you create a space that is taking that topology, that landscape into account? My sense is it has a lot to do with sharing the phenomenology of where you are on the path right now. Right, and it's not sharing everything, right? It's very specific. You're going to share the phenomenology of how you're relating to the great matter at this moment, how it's actually going on for you. And then there's a transmission function that comes from that. In a space where one person is going to tell you the story of their awakening, it has a great transmissive power, but it doesn't do this other thing that comes from the circulation of people saying wherever they are in that process, but keeping very focused on the phenomenology and not the beliefs about the experience. Just sharing what it seems like you're going through and where you are in that. That seems to me to create a shared spiritual resonance space.
Absolutely. The way I think about it in my teaching is we go from communion to communication to community. And that actually without people sharing the phenomenology of their realization, then without that communication, that community actually isn't wired in at that depth. What you've wired in, as you were saying, is that you wire in a kind of maybe a postmodern sensibility. That's okay. And so actually the community is functioning at one level and then goes somewhere else in personal practice, but comes back there.
And those are the unwritten rules that are followed.
That's right.
Yeah.
As opposed to democratizing the realization, of course, when it's there, and then beginning to share, because then essentially the Sangha begins to operate as a transmission process rather than just the teacher.
Yeah, and you do see a bit of that in Zen, right? Koans are fantastic. They do many different things, but one of the things they do is present usually two or a couple of people having that phenomenological exchange, right? It's a real time back and forth, and it creates this intersubjective wisdom packet within that community.
Right.
That's one of the reasons it's so valuable to preserve and pass on those stories.
Right. I'm curious. Yeah, Catherine, I'm curious, like in your community, how are you doing this work? Because it seems like quality and community at the same time.
Yes. Well, we're at such an interesting time in history when these great ambassadors of realization came from the East and transmitted it to the West. These great individuals who had students and gave transmission to more teachers. So the numbers of beings with realization is increasing. And which introduces the we, right? So now that there's not one great teacher transmitting to a lot of people with far less realization, but it's getting more towards the middle. How do we operate together? I think that's what we're talking about here. I just wanted to say it in some different words. So yes, we live in community at our center, Clear Sky Retreat Center, and I've been living there since 2014 full-time, and it's been a fascinating process. And for me, it was really difficult to transition from having, I was already sort of living in community, but still had, my place, and there's a dissolution of boundaries that happens. That's not just the boundaries of the ego identity that we've been talking about, but the boundaries of, what's my stuff and what's your stuff and what's everybody's stuff and what's my time, what's my schedule, what's the schedule, and a lot of giving up of control. And very difficult transition for me initially to for example, learned to not close my door every time I went back to my room. Just these small things were very telling. And it's been especially interesting to see almost every person who comes to reside in our community go through the kind of same process of this adjusting from having a kind of nuclear individualistic life to learning to live in community. And the transition's not a pleasant one. I think we love the idea of living in community. And then when we start to do it, we pretty much freak out and have a really hard time giving up control. And then if we can survive that transition, it's such a tremendous relief. I don't need to be taking care of all of my own stuff because we're all taking care of the stuff together. I don't need one of everything because it's mine, but we share all these things, and there's a beauty in the sharing. I don't need to decide what I'm going to do every day because there's an awesome schedule that keeps us all on track and all sharing an experience, which is what we're here for. So that's part of my lived experience. And then I think, as Alexander was saying, the universe delivers the situation, the person that we need at any given time to show where we need to grow, and kind of drive us crazy, and until we learn to not be driven crazy by this particular arising, and manifests as the plumbing stopping to work in the middle of a retreat, and nobody can take a shower, and not sure if you can use the toilet either. Can everybody roll with it, right? Well, that's what our practice is for, right? Not that you want to set up those kind of conditions intentionally to test everybody, but it does help us see whether our practice is working.
What I hear is just a really deep refuge in Sangha, and also and just a recognition of what an important part of what's going to unfold in the metacrisis over the next decades, how important that is. And also in my own body, as still living in a kind of nuclear family setup, the kind of like, yes, well, I don't, even whilst at the same time, like, yes, right, yes.
It brings up for me this, questions around like, what does it mean to take refuge in the Sangha, and at what level of depth, and what does that look like, and what does that give birth to? I follow two traditions. One is very much, don't talk about your spiritual experiences. Like every positive thing that happens, digest it, or like write a letter to the teacher. Right. And then the other tradition, it's very much share your experiences. And my sense is that there's gifts in both, in the holding on from like the key, restraining from sharing experiences. There's kind of an inner intimacy that occurs, like when there can't be energy that goes out with it, it has to go a different direction. And that there's a kind of intimacy there. But on the other hand, in the context of taking refuge in the Sangha, then when we're together, what do we talk about? Well, we typically talk about things rather than speaking from direct experience. And I find that then there's something lost, because in that intersubjective space where we're speaking phenomenologically, a lot of realization occurs in that is missed sort of when you're not allowed. And so I think that there's a potential for intimacy there when there is the invitation to share and to speak from direct experience. On the other hand, in the community where we don't talk about the experiences, there is an intimacy that occurs through only something that can be felt. We feel the love that's imbuing in the devotion, in the fact that everybody, when there's a gathering, everybody is there doing service and nobody's getting paid, and they're doing it for the love of the Sangha, although they wouldn't use the word Sangha. But it's again, it requires listening for the sweetness somewhere else. So I kind of see, I think in our era, we need the intersubjective direction. Like, I have no doubt. But I also, as I'm just sort of holding these two traditions and what everybody's sharing, there's kind of some gifts I see of both, even though I think this era we need to learn how to communicate in a deep way from direct experience, because there's where teachings start to emerge on their own.
Right.
Yeah.
In the, as some of you might know, in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, they talk about body, speech, and mind, and that speech itself is directly related to the Sambhogakaya dimension, which is this intermediary dimension, which is where like the subtle lattice work of Sangha or where we exist, and therefore when one communicates, where one is communicating from, even if you're talking about something else, but particularly if you're talking about realization, then transmission happens and communication happens, and community becomes has a lot more tensegrity to it.
The communities are multi-discourse spaces, right? Whether that's the men and the women gathered differently, or the old and the young, or sometimes we're talking about how to organize things, and sometimes we're talking about our experience. A thriving community it's like a rich ecosystem. It has to make all these different kinds of discourse spaces available. So the background for all of them maybe is a nonverbal appreciation of the sweetness of the thing we're joined in. Sometimes we have to have explicit conversations of various kinds, including the existential conversation. But it's not meant to be the constant discussion. Just like in meta-reflective spaces, there is this possibility of having a conversation about the conversation we're having. That can be very useful, but it's also a trap. You get stuck in that one kind of conversation all the time. So the community has to be a rich circulating ecosystem of discourses.
Right. So the community opens us up into just a deeper sense of interdependence, a deeper sense of we. And in many ways, the kind of the meditative practices that open up the kind of absolute nature of the heart mind do the same thing. On the other hand, on the return journey down the mountain, where emptiness becomes coalesced as form, and each of us, 5 of us here, have like we're unique beings with unique gifts, that, if you will, and maybe traditionally in a more conformist mythic level civilization where these teachings arose from. Even if you look at the Vajrayana, there's probably like 20 flavors to choose from. You can be green Tara, you can be mint, you can be like, medicine Buddha, these are the flavors. But there does seem something about, paradoxically, also apprenticing ourselves to our own uniqueness that is as demanding, if you will, as apprenticing ourselves to something beyond us, right? Because at some level of practice, when you really begin to recognize that you're not that, well, then you're like, well, I have to serve this self as well. And this self, it needs to blossom. And if I don't do that, then actually my vowing is not creative. It's not living. So I'm just curious, how do you hold that? Like, how do you value the uniqueness? I mean, there's got some really unique individuals here. How does that sensibility fit in?
Is this a question, John, about the relationship between the individual and the community?
I think it's part of that.
Together?
Yes, I think that's part of it, because if you don't value your uniqueness in community, then it's flowers are beautiful, but if it's all daisies or all right, then there's a kind of fascist kind of piece to it. We get lost. So fascist daisies, like it's only daisies.
That's actually the name of my band.
The fascist. Yeah. So yes, I mean, how do you discover and deepen? I mean, the question is, how do you do it? But also, like, even valuing the uniqueness is not part of the traditional bodhisattvic.
Right. Well, that's a great question. I think we've been sold a false bill of goods with our hyper individualistic culture that the result of which is really loneliness and isolation. And yet there's not a real good roadmap for how to live in community, or especially we know of communities that seem to function fairly well, but the roadmap for the transition, how to get there from here, is not real clear if that's not been a part of our culture or our experience. And my experience is that when someone can live in community, we do need to give up our sense of independence. And it's really kind of a concept. There's a real defense of, this is my life and I need to choose how I'm living it and I need to show up and it's very rigid and exhausting. And if we can kind of just relax that a bit into being in community, we still are showing up as ourselves because there's not really any other choice.
Well, I would imagine that just if we put that on a developmental scale, like shifting from 3.5 to 4.5 is more perspectives, which means actually more uniqueness within that, not less. So I'm curious.
Yes.
So how have you experienced like more uniqueness in giving up the independence, which is like giving up 3.5 for something more interdependent that then also allows for greater creativity and not less creativity?
Yes. Well, I think in the context of community, our different strengths start to emerge. And oftentimes we may not even know what those strengths are ourselves. We may not know our own strengths, and other people in community point them out to us and invite us to draw them out more. That's a really exciting thing. It's really exciting to discover strengths that you didn't know that you had and that other people are appreciating. And then we can also get a little bit in a rut of certain strengths and show up again and again in a certain way or a certain context. And then see how someone thrives in a role that we never really were attracted to, but they're doing it so beautifully. It makes us want to imagine ourselves like, well, maybe that isn't as distasteful as I thought that it was, and maybe I might actually enjoy doing that. And being in community, we have the scaffolding to support us experimenting that way in different roles and different functions showing up in different ways. And it's a lot of fun.
It's really, what I'm getting, what's really interesting is, of course, the depth of interdependence between community and uniqueness, right? That actually it's not, that the one's uniqueness, at least within a metamodern context, at least if you're looking for that, I mean, I'm sure if you want to lose yourself in community, that's very easy to do. But
easy to lose yourself?
It would be if one doesn't want to see certain things. I mean, I can imagine that some people, in more conformist situations,
like Christian monastery.
Yes, well, even a Zen monastery, right?
Well, same thing, yeah.
So I think it's like what is the cultural, what is allowed in that culture to be expressed, right? Because if it isn't, I mean, this has got to do with the developmental nature of community. I guess it can either inhibit uniqueness or actually like foster it.
Did you say Eastern monastery? Do you mean in Asia?
A Christian, and he transcends Zen, but
any monastery.
They do tend to hammer anybody that wants to be an individual. It's not really the point of the monastery.
I see, right?
As opposed to liberating it at a metamodern, where it's like actually this is part of the duty of
yes.
Right?
Yes. The value of merging these contemplative traditions with integral is perhaps precisely that.
Yes, because it does allow. I mean, my view in terms of, I know Alexander wants to just pop in. Maybe pass it to you, Alex, before I continue.
Well, there's so much. I mean, but on this thread here, I mean, it's the value of sympoiesis. It's valuing that we're becoming with each other. And like, even in this conversation, if there was one different person that was here instead, it would be drawing out various other shades of all of our uniquenesses. And I think that so there's the community aspect of how we invite or shape communities that both recognize that there's a complete sameness, the Dharmakaya, sort of the ground of sameness, but then there are these like various colors of light that when nurtured, it flourishes the collective. It's this thing of like, oh, how do we nourish the individual and nourish the collective so that both are bringing forth, both are coming forward in their own set of gifts that sort of creates a healthier whole. The other thing that I wanted to share is, this question of, well, who am I? And we get into this notion of nature, like what is my nature? And in the Chinese medicine tradition, the word xing, which means nature, it's actually used in more than one way. And it's used as like root nature, which is the Dharmakaya. This is the sameness. There is no difference. That dimension of us hasn't entered a stream of time, so isn't subjected to this kind of emergence and unfolding. But the same character for nature also refers to our unique nature. And you can think of this like from the Dharmakaya, there's sort of this luminescent light, the Sambhogakaya, but at some point it funnels through the uniqueness of Layman's prism.
It does.
It very much does. And then it shines through the uniqueness of Keith's prism. And when that occurs, there's a unique signature that has never departed from its continuosity with the Dharmakaya and with that deeper light, but it takes on a signature that becomes this unique gift, and we feel it in the form of our passion and our curiosity and our care. And I'm interested in this intersection of things rather than some other intersection of things, and that seems to be one of the ways that the whole cosmos creates something just remarkably complex and beautiful, because not one of us could unpack the whole thing.
Right.
It's just too much. It's too vast. And so we need these sort of multiplicity of prisms that kind of help fill in this larger mosaic, larger sort of light show.
It seems that the what you're pointing to is as an organism, because we are one, and that's like in Chinese medicine, obviously you've got various organ systems. But actually, in order to function, you want the uniqueness, because that's actually what allows the liver to function as a liver and the spleen to function as a spleen. And the greater the degree of uniqueness, the greater the capacity for universality, that they come together. It's kind of interesting that they both have the same kind of prefix of uni, that it doesn't reject the uniqueness of the individual to also be deeply universal in our functions. So I'm curious, how are each of you apprenticing yourselves to your uniqueness? Like,
well, right, it's a tricky thing, right? Because it's from a Amber perspective, the self is defined by the rules of the culture. Yeah, that's why we don't want to stand up and do photos necessarily unless you have one of the big hats on. Every Amber culture, your status is determined by the size of your hat. So you get this hats, Pope's got the big hat and say, that's the important guy. He's got the big hat on. Nobody else has hats.
Layman's got the hat on.
That's an individual right there, and that's the one that matters. And then we get into a green culture, and it's like, like my unique self. And you have to validate my needs. I'm uniquely wounded. You listen to my unique story and how it's uniquely manifested in my unique pain. Right? And so we have to go through that process, which is painful, both to be in it and to be receiving it. And then I think we get to what we're talking about here, which is we start to see that the ego is a process. It's not a self. Right? It's like there is no Keith, right? It's just it's biological, cultural, psychological conditioning all packed together that makes this genuinely unique manifestation that is this Keithness. And I'm unique, just like everyone else is unique. We're unique. And so there's a hilarious uniformity and non-uniqueness in our uniqueness, which to me allows us to honor it because it is important. As Alexander was saying, right? It's like, we're drawn to certain teachers because of their uniqueness. They have a certain charisma and they transmit the Dharma in a different way than the other person does, right? It's like, oh, why is it? I don't know. They got a magnetism that I like. So uniqueness is absolutely vital. It's how we grow. It's the innovators among us, the Einsteins, and all these people that their unique creativity, their unique genius really moves the species forward. As long as we don't believe the press too much. Yeah. So go then.
Totally.
Totally.
Yeah, there's kind of a divergence in how we think about going beyond the personal, right? We can think about going toward the impersonal or towards something else. I sometimes call it the hyper-personal. And what makes the difference in that choice as individuals and as a system? And I think about maybe three things: about view, and about health, and about art. The view is a set of views, really, among people who have fluency with paradox as a sense-making tool, right? So we're able to say the unique is not the opposite of the universal. In fact, it's a universally, the homogeneous thing is diversity, is uniqueness. That's what's distributed the same everywhere, is difference. Or sympoiesis, right? This plastic gold chain that's visually distinguishing me is something that Alexander gave me. So he's my...
that Alexander lent you.
For this podcast.
For this podcast. Exactly.
There are lots of meta-level ways to think that revalidate uniqueness because they undoes the dichotomy that's usually held between the distinct and the indistinct. Right? We could even say it's not thinkable to separate unique from not unique. They're really always coupled on some kind of a creative gradient. So there's views like that are empowering to the uniqueness in a metamodern sense, in a way that doesn't sabotage the growth of our attunement to universality. There's the view. The health part is, Jorge Ferrer recently has been saying the integral Bodhisattva vow is no part left behind. Right? So the more of your organic complexity that's coming along with you, the more you can operate as a unique being. Right? And maybe our distant ancestors thought about that more in terms of animal types, right, rather than individual humans. But we're all different. If somebody's a raccoon, you got to be a good raccoon. Somebody's a raven, you got to be a good raven. That sense that it's a healthiness to beings that are operating with the consent of the flourishing of their full inner complexity, and that creates a kind of uniqueness of function in a system. And then there's artistry. And for me, that's been the biggest part of apprenticing to the uniqueness, as you put it, which is to say the great universal human, but especially Western, and for me, you have the Renaissance to some degree, but the great French art movements of the early 20th century, the Dada and Surrealism and all those sorts of things. I was so in love with that as a kid, right? That it shone forth to me with the same power that Dharma shone forth to me. But there was something that those things had in common. Right? There was something about what Salvador Dali was doing to the character of Salvador Dali, which was not in any way opposed to his attempt to merge with something transcendent, right? But I think you have to fall in love with the possibilities that are opened up by the work of stylizing your character. You have to have examples of that, and examples of that don't seem to foreclose your other developmental possibilities.
It's like that statement, writing about happiness is like writing with white ink on a white page. And it's talking about how, like, as human beings, we live in this world of polarization and dichotomy and, heroes and falling from grace and like all these kinds of things that when that uniqueness comes out, it's exciting. It's interesting. It invites us to lean in, and in that, I think we touch something more intimately because the artist moved that gesture just so, and it struck us that if everything was sort of homogeneous and it's all about just the one thing that doesn't move, while it's fine when you're already sort of in realization of that one thing that doesn't move, we are moving. And when we are allowed to move in our own unique ways, it's exciting, it's compelling, it creates art, it creates soul, it creates an aliveness. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention based on what you were saying is the domain of health. And, if we want to steward, humanity in some way to discover their deeper nature, there seems to be a quicker route through supporting skillfully people's uniqueness and their genuine contribution. When we impose a lot of repressive tactics, yes, awakening is still possible, but there's a whole bunch of other mess that kind of is now in the way of that ego structure becoming something healthy so that it can eventually become everything. And there seems to be an elegance that's possible there when that health piece that you're describing is sort of engendered, nurtured.
The role of discrimination in suchness is really interesting, right? Because you can appreciate the suchness of anything and everything, but you can also go, no, that one's really screaming suchness to me, right? And there's a uniqueness not just in how you show up as a character, there's a uniqueness in how you recognize the world. I think this has a lot to do with the subtle ways in which we appreciate ecologies, right? If you, as a very simple sort of shamanic example, you send somebody in the woods, bring back the perfect rock for the ritual. And there's a lot of rocks out there. They've got to find just the right one. And each one of them, you could move into the mode where it's exactly the right one because everything is exactly the right one. But one of the exactly the right ones is exactly the right one. Right, so that's an extra skill set, but I think it's really important to bring that skill set forward to amplify the aesthetics of the cosmos that we're participating in.
Well, I'd like to just give a shout out to people who are watching or listening who may feel like you're in an acute state of suffering. Because as we apprentice to our own uniqueness, that's really a precious time. It's a precious transition zone in that uniqueness coming forth. Similar to Alexander, I've had a very intimate experience with death recently when my guru and my partner passed away a year and a half ago. And it's such a tremendous transition to go from doing everything together to doing everything together with another person and community, and then have that very important other person not there anymore. And there's a profound grief that's natural. That's a process that we need to go through. And there's such a beauty within that grief. There's such a connection with all the other people on the planet who have experienced this profound loss, which is everyone. Death is sure for all of us. We may not have experienced it yet, but we will. And it's a kind of invisible connection that we all have and don't often talk about. So I've felt a real beauty with that connection with many people who I may never know through this experience of loss. And then also this kind of reinvention of oneself that becomes possible, or adaptation or new interpretation, because all the things that we decided together, now I'm deciding more from my own agency. And that's exciting and creative and terrifying and a big responsibility. I can't blame anything on my partner anymore. I'm sure he wished that came earlier, right? But there are a lot of compromises in a relationship, and then when those compromises are taken away, we kind of miss them. And then we choose how we want to show up. And so to any of you feeling like you're suffering now, it's really just an opportunity to reshape how you're going to want to show up. So that's exciting.
We when we started, we were talking about what that minimal viable shared kind of bodhisattvic fabric might be culturally, and I think we agree that the kind of the evolving universe was part of that meta narrative. And as we're leaning into individuality, both the ground of being universality and then the healing dimension, but there's also this creative dimension, which I think is the evolutionary dimension, right? And without the recognition of the healing, sometimes when I'm teaching, I talk about like there's the way of the pearl and there's the way of the snake, and they're two different ways of transforming. And the way of the pearl is a kind of metacognitive love, wisdom, relating with what's occurring in such a way that it creates beauty from suffering. And I think I would imagine all of us here and those who are listening recognize that so much of transformation isn't about transforming what's happening, but how we're relating to what's happening. Right? That's a really, I would imagine we all had a moment in our lives where like, it's about this move, not about that move. And then there's also the way of the snake, which is change, like move, breathe,
Shed the skin.
Like and that also has real merit, right? And so this creative edge between knowing when to be still to be able to attune, and knowing when to move, because actually that's what movement wants to happen. And our uniqueness is at that sweet spot where both of those are happening. And so as unique beings who are kind of waiting and moving, we're living as unique beings in a unique moment in time, right? It's never been like this and never will be again. So I'm curious, as we wrap this up, and to share with our friends who are listening, like how are each of us coming to terms with what the unique quest or the unique artistry, like what is unique about being bodhisattvas at this moment in time? For you, but also for us. If we sat here in the Song Dynasty, or if we sat here in Nalanda University, or if we sat here at Samye in Tibet, we would have the same conversation, but it probably wouldn't have come out the same way. What's unique about this time? And hence, what's unique about us?
Yeah, my sense is that what comes up for me is a mixture of what's unique and also what isn't unique. And I'll start with the what isn't unique. My sense is that there's a universal need that has occurred over every epoch for human beings to learn how to be held in their pain so that they build a new relationship with experience. And so my sense is from that side of it, a bodhisattva's job in this time is still to love inexhaustibly and deeply. But if we then bring in the question of uniqueness, it brings into the language, learning how to love precisely. And precisely brings us into a recognition of the developmental complexity. that loving a 7-year-old has different requirements for what that charge is, what that child needs is different than the 15-year-old, the 18-year-old, the adults throughout the various sort of moments along their process of becoming. And I think that we can get really refined and skillful in understanding what are the developmental needs of a collective, of an individual, not as ladder stair steps, but as an unfolding human whole. I like to think of development more like a piano, like chords on a piano or chords on a harp, where each person has this whole developmental history that's a part of their unique signature of becoming in a particular moment. And I think in this era, for us to develop the skills to be able to listen closely to all of those notes, not just like what stage are they at, but all of those notes and how they're playing and the textures of the cry can then evoke that love that's always been what we need, that compassion that's always been what we need. But we can bring in some specific nuances to support that individual in the way they need to be supported. And then holding them in the context of the larger ecology, that they're not just an individual, but they are in direct relationship with the whole of existence. And we have a place in that relationship to maybe offer a loving hand in a way that really matters and can help the person see that they are a gift and that their pain and their torment is a deep, deep gift. And no one wants to be told that. So that's not our job. That's not our job. Our job is to love them precisely so that it becomes a natural discovery from within. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Thank you, Alexander.
I think I would take it in a direction. I would say we all know the external things that are unique about this time. AI, the metacrises that are unfolding, all of these different, late stage capitalism. All these, those are all sort of unique and easy and obvious. But I think one of the really unique things is, for millennia, it was a red culture based on power and control. And then we had this amber cultures that evolved over hundreds and thousands of years that really were rule-based and myth-based second-person cultures. And they reigned for thousands of years. Just this uniformity, grandfathers to grandfathers to grandfathers to grandfathers to grandfathers, on and on. And then just 300 years ago, we have this new evolution of this quote unquote third person perspective, this enlightenment, this objectivity of, okay, wait a minute, we can see the myths. Now we have 3 worldviews that are all coexisting. And then you go back about 70, 80, 90 years, and then there's this 4th perspective, this green perspective, this context-aware perspective. Objectivity is bound in contexts of culture, culturism, and enculturation. And so now we have 4 worldviews that are in the world. And then we have integral, in the last maybe 30, 40 years, comes online and says, oh, no, wait, these are all frames that are sort of created, and every worldview is itself a frame, including this frame. And so what I see as unique is we've never lived in a time where 5 worldviews are all simultaneously operating on big scales all over the world. And it makes the complexity of what we do much, much harder. How do we interface with a different culture, with a different individual? It was a lot easier when there were 2 worlds, 2 ways of being. Power-based or rule-based. Look, I've got the rules, and I'm going to show you what they are by force if necessary, so you don't create chaos. So we're in this uniquely challenging position of, until we can see development at a bigger level, at a bigger scale, we can never apply the right solution to the right problem. And that's what I see as the uniqueness and the unique challenge of this time. Thank you.
No previous epoch was blessed to have the music of Keith's band Fascist Daisy, which we'll be performing tonight in Boulder.
It's true. Only $10. Please stop.
Are you sure about that? I mean, I seem to remember that there were some times where it was. It reminds me of
Lots of God get onto the subject of time. We may have a
some of those Soviet rock bands had a little.
The Fascist Daisy.
a few of the things that make this moment unique. One of them is that we have to intentionalize things that were taken for granted traditionally, right? To be embodied, to have culture at all. The background of the entire ecological system was assumed for our ancestors. Now it seems like an open question. It seems like it's in jeopardy, and that jeopardy produces a response of care. So there's something we have to do on purpose now that was a given for most of the way our ancestors did this practice. Two is the apocalyptic mood. Right? There's a little bit of how do we avoid or how do we accept the feeling of doom and uncertainty at huge scales in a radical sense. Every piece of news we consume suggests the possibility of radical disruption. And in order to liberate our hearts to be participants, we somehow have to die to something we were holding on. We have to really accept the doom and the tragedy, that the apocalypse is not just an anxious fantasy that bedevils us. It's an intrinsic part of what we need to accept in order to show up at this moment. And then the other thing is, to use a Whiteheadian expression, the ingression of the strange. There's something, to my mind, about the weirdness temperature increasing. That the amount of content that you encounter where you go, I don't know what the fuck that means. That's increasing.
UAP thing.
Yeah, UAP is a perfect example.
What the hell's
right?
going on?
Whether it's politics, ontology, cosmology, technology, the shows we consume, everything's gotten way stranger. And I think that's going to increase, and it has to be part of the way we think about humanizing and sacralizing and naturalizing the world in these times. We have to really accept the kind of rupture or collision that's represented by a question mark and an exclamation mark tightly wound together. We're deep into weird times. It's a feature, not a bug, and we have to take that on as part of our Dharma work.
Thank you, Layman. Catherine?
So one of the things that I love about being alive at this time is that the opportunities for being agents of transformative change, positive change, are also so tremendous. Like Layman is saying, we do need to hold this potential apocalypse at the same time that we're holding the need we all have for a sense of stability day to day. And we're in a position where we can do that. If we're building a new building, we can build it, maybe required by law to build it hooked up to the grid, and we can also build it with backup systems in case the grid fails and we need to live in that different reality that looks like it's coming down the pike. We can look at weather systems and see whether the droughts and the wildfires that we're experiencing in this part of the world can be remedied by addressing ecologies in other parts of the world. Perhaps greening the deserts in Africa could help end the droughts that we're experiencing here. And that could create a really beautiful win-win situation. And that's actually something that we could undertake, that we could support that movement on the other side of the planet. And that's quite new. We can support Indigenous people to return to their historic role, those that are interested of being stewards of the land, and participate in the healing of that rupture in humanity that occurred in our colonial heritage.
Mm.
We could do all of these things in the same month. We could participate in all of this goodness and all of this redressing of the world's challenges that we're facing. And in my experience, that goes a long way for alleviating the anxiety and the despair and the grief that we feel about all of these things happening today.
Yeah. Thank you. I have both the sense that there's a really deep need for both the universal and then to take everything like significantly more personally. So I was recently asked, like, what's my spiritual practice? I'm like, taking things more personally, right? That there's actually, and this speaks to the need in this time for uniqueness, because that's where our creativity comes from. That's where your creativity comes from. So there's this, I think we're all faced with this great moment of opportunity for creativity, because we have to witness the hospicing of the end of one time and the midwifing of another. In my own kind of mythopoesis of where we find ourselves, I'm like, oh yeah, this is the end of time. Like, there's no way we're going to be running on a Gregorian calendar in 30 years. Like, you think AI systems are going to think that that's a really good idea? Absolutely not. And that's been anticipated in the collective psyche for a while. Like, oh, the train runs off the tracks now, right? So, and then if you can like dial into that, like, oh, we're talking about to get through this, we have to have a mythic sensibility to recognize, oh, end of time. Oh, that's a judgment day. It's like, oh, the wheel goes one way, or the wheel of AI goes one way, or goes the other way, or it goes both ways simultaneously. But judgment's related to creativity, right? And so we have this amazing opportunity in front of us for creativity and for asking ourselves. I think was it you that said, Keith, or like, there were all these things were given to us previously, and now actually that they're not. Now actually we actually like, oh, like we have to choose. We haven't inherited 1,000-year lineage. Like we actually have to, with everything, we have a creative choice, from even like what time we're living in, how we're going to live, how we're going to relate to one another. And so what a great responsibility that we have, but also as budding bodhisattvas, what a creative moment to be alive and to be journeying like this. So Alexander, thank you for being here. Layman, thank you. Really appreciate it. Catherine, thank you so much. Keith, thank you. Thank you, everybody in the studio. We really appreciate your support in making this happen. And I know all 5 of us just dedicate whatever merits might have been gathered. There's a lot of joy here. I felt a lot of joy in the field and excitement. And so we hope that joy ripples through the interconnected field and blossoms into goodness and truth and beauty. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And God bless. It's a wrap. That was fun.
It was fun.